Good evening, and welcome to Kevin Tries to Explain Karl Marx's Das Kapital. Just Volume 1, mind you. We're also going to try to explain this as quickly as possibly and as simply as possibly. This is practically impossible, first and foremost, because Karl Marx is a very intricate writer, and so he likes to introduce a lot of concepts very quickly and then, really play around with those concepts for quite some time. So if at any point you're ever confused, I really recommend you go and look up David Harvey's Companion to Capital, either the book or the YouTube series. There are 12 parts of them, and each of them sort of discusses in incredible detail. I'm talking masterclass level detail, the whole of Volume 1. But if you're not interested in any of that nonsense, you're just interested in knowing the gist of it, well then, I guess this is the video for you. So, where do we begin? Well, Karl Marx was writing this around the 1860s. He actually died by the time Volume 2 and Volume 3 came out. So Volume 1 is the only volume of Das Kapital that was actually written by Karl Marx. This has a somewhat unfortunate side effect of the fact that all of the great fascinating, intricate material that is in Part 2 and Part 3, they lose some of the clarity and some of the nuance that Marx brings to Volume 1. I will most certainly do a video on Volume 2 and Volume 3 in the very near future, but for the time being, we will focus on Volume 1. Now, what does Volume 1 deal with? Well, Volume 1 deals with basically what is capital? Where does it come from? Where does investment come from? Where do commodities come from? Where does value come from? Where does prices come from? Where does money come from, for God's sakes? All of these questions are going to be explored by Karl Marx in this book, and it's fascinating because the way in which he actually describes the economy is completely distinct from the modern conception of the economy. But I claim it's as rigorous as modern economic understandings of the world. Marxism is based fundamentally in this understanding of capitalism, but the thing that's funny about Das Kapital is not really a socialist text. It's not really a revolutionary text in any way. It's not about socialism. So if you're coming to this video thinking this is going to be some crank explain to you why revolution is necessary, you're in the wrong book. Unfortunately, Das Kapital is really an economic understanding of what capitalism is and how capitalism works. So, with all that in mind, let's try to bring ourselves back into the 1860s, and let's begin with what is capital. Now, capital is, well, we're going to get there in a minute. First and foremost, I need you to just drop any preconceptions or pre-understandings that you may have from economics. Margin, if you studied economics at all, you studied margin, you studied rational choice theory, all of that, just forget about it. Just try to imagine you don't understand any of that. Just try to move away from that for a minute. And let's just talk about where you would begin if you were trying to explain economics whole cloth. Now, Marx doesn't start whole cloth. He doesn't just jump right in, as it were, and try to explain everything as if he was the grand master of everything. It's not. He's actually very strongly influenced by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, two of the foremost classical political economists of his era, before he started writing. So he's actually reacting to a very very critically important field of economics in that era. So, where does Marx begin? Marx begins with understanding the commodity. You see, it turns out by a strange, if you don't understand anything else about economics, the wealth of society appears as a collection of commodities. You look at the cars, you look at the watches, you look at the gold, the silver, the bonds, the stocks, the airplanes. If you want to look at wealth, you look at physical objects. If you want to understand how wealthy someone is, that person has a Bugatti, that person has a Lamborghini, etc., etc. Commodities form the basis, no matter what historical era you're in, whether you're in a tribalistic era, where a prehistory, where you're sort of moving through the forest with you and your family members, whether you're in a feudal era, commodities are this sort of historically distinct thing, and they're not unique to capitalism. They've always been there. People have always made things. Human labor has always done work, and work has always created things. People have always made axes, houses, chairs, tables. They've made bread. They've made cake. They've made things. That's just like, there aren't too many universal laws, but that is almost one of them. Humans work. They do things with their time. So, how do we understand the value of any particular good in that society? Well, the simplest understanding of value is use value, which is the value is just whatever's useful to you. It's incredibly subjective, but it's also incredibly personal. Like, this coat is particularly useful for me because it keeps me at a perfect temperature. This axe is built just for my hands. This bow works. I'm just really good with that particular bow. It's my bow, this particular computer works really well for my particular needs. And the thing is, use values they haven't gone away. Commodities always have use value, and the bulk of human history has been trading use values for use values. It's, well, I have too much of this, so I'm going to trade it for some more of that. But we'll get to that in a second. That effectively forms the use value of a thing. Now, if you were to, the thing is, if you have too much of one thing and you want something of someone else's, you have to exchange it. Well, I just said that use value is incredibly subjective. Well, if use value is subjective, how do you compare the value between two commodities? How do you, two things? Like, I have a bread that I made this morning. I have some bread, a loaf of bread, and you happen to have a fishing rod. And we're going to trade these because you have a few fishing rods and you don't need that one. How do we possibly weigh and balance how much bread, how much of my loaf, or how good quality of a fishing pole? How do we equate these two things? They're completely different. And so Marx says that alongside use value, there is a separate understanding of value called the exchange value. And effectively, when me and this other person are talking, and I'm saying, well, I want to trade this loaf of bread to you, and this person says, well, I spent 3 days making this fishing pole. I had to get the rope. I had to get the rope to put for the rod. I had to get the metal to screw it in. I had to whittle down the stick for hours upon hours. It only took you like 30 minutes to make a loaf of bread. It's not just valued at one loaf of bread, my friend. I'm going to need something more than that. So suddenly, in hoping to seek fairness in order to seek a good price for his fishing pole, our fisherman friend here wants more than just one loaf of bread because he says he took longer for him to make it. Okay, but that's this leads to a very problematic understanding of the labor theory of value. When I had a professor in first year, he literally said, Marx is wrong because if I spend more time making something, that means it's more valuable. Which means if I dig a hole in the ground, because I spend 8 hours doing that, well, that's worth more than someone who only spent 5 hours of work. That's insane, therefore Marx is wrong. And Marx understands this dilemma. He realizes the logical flaw of looking at a commodity strictly in just how one specific person, how long it takes that person to make that good. So this fisherman right here, it may have taken him 2 days to make it, but maybe he's old, maybe he has arthritis, maybe it just takes him far longer than the average person. The average person only takes about a half a day or so. And so in our tribe, which is our society, let's say that our collection of tribes, the only people we really know, so it's like 5 or 6 tribes or whatever. And Marx breaks this down very technically by describing the understanding of one specific commodity, the amount of labor that went into that very specific commodity, this one specific fishing rod, this one specific bed, this one chair, etc. That's the concrete labor. You can actually measure that. Like you could stand there with a stopwatch and watch someone make a chair, hit start, and then when they're done, hit stop, and you would then understand concretely. But Marx says that it doesn't stop there. He basically moves on to what's known as the abstract labor. And the abstract labor is, if you take a step back and you look at society as a whole, how long does it take society as a whole to produce that particular good? And that sort of larger question of how long it takes the average person, not a particularly skilled person, not a particularly poor person, the average person in that society to make that one specific commodity. Let's say in this tribe it takes a week for them to find enough iron to make an axe. It takes a week. It takes a long time. That means that iron is incredibly valuable. You can only make so much of it in a given year, and that ultimately, if they manage to find a faster way to make iron, well, that makes it so that they can have more iron, and that ultimately brings down the value of that iron in terms of how it would be exchanged along with other goods. You can start to see how it's a little fuzzy, right? How would anyone particularly know what this? But just bear with Marx for just a brief moment, because what he's talking about is averages, and when you're talking about it in that sense, in social sciences, averages are an abstraction, is the way that we describe a lot of phenomena in society, and it may be difficult to momentarily quantify it, but its effect always shows itself up in a very intuitive way in society. Now, this leads to the fundamental point of Marx's labor theory. The labor value fused into a good when it was made comes at the cost of the goods that was needed to sustain the average worker during that period. Whoa, okay, hold on. What does that even mean? What Marx is saying is, let's say it takes a week for someone to find iron, okay? Like you say, you go find iron. You're pretty good at finding iron. You're average at doing so. You average tribesman, go find iron. And that man walks off and tries to find some iron. And before he goes off to go get iron, how much food and water do you need to give him so that he can stay alive enough to find, that iron and come back? And then if you think about it, how long did it take for other tribesmen to make that food and to gather that water? So you start to see that the cost of that iron is directly related to the cost of the goods that the worker needs in order to sustain himself, him or her or themselves. And Marx sort of expands on that a bit. So that's a very specific example. But then imagine, you sort of step yourself back. Imagine you're in Victorian London. Marx is talking, because he lived in Victorian London, he's talking specifically about people's living standards. So the living standard of the average worker that works in the coal factory, the coal mines, and the coal factory, the coal industry, that has a direct link to the value of coal in England in that time, because it's tied directly to the amount of the cost of purchasing that basket of goods to give to the laborer so that the laborer can have his overalls and his sandwich and his house and his tea in the afternoon, everything, all of that which again is completely socially constructed, all of that is directly tied into the value of that coal. And so Marx calls this the socially necessary labor time, because it's the amount of labor time that is for the average worker and the average amount of skill and the average the average person, what is socially needed by that person for them to maintain themselves. And that forms the basis of the exchange value of a specific commodity. Now, Marx doesn't overlook supply and demand. A lot of people say, okay, he ignores supply and demand, and modern economics is all about supply and demand, and he just ignores it. He doesn't ignore it. It's Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the people he's reacting to, argued and very much believed that supply and demand eventually would equalize around an absolute form of value. And they argued that absolute form of value was the labor theory of value. And their labor theory of value is ultimately not as nuanced as Marx's labor theory of value, but that's beside the point. Marx says that supply and demand certainly has an impact, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but it has an impact, but the price fluctuations caused by supply and demand are fundamentally tied to the exchange value present in that commodity. And I know it's a bold claim, but you have to work with it, just bear with it and sort of internalize it for just a brief moment. And it will hopefully become clear very soon. But if I'm dithering on about exchange value, how does exchange value express itself in society? How do we quantify this? How do we measure what exchange value is? And exchange value is measured by price, which is, as Marx describes, a kind of shorthand for the exchange value. And eventually Marx claims that price begins to effectively become used far more often than the amount of labor present within some particular commodity. Like, for instance, if your grandmother knits you a shirt, you think of it as a lot more valuable than, the average sweater, which is just found in and around your stores or supermarkets or whatever. But if when you pass away and someone gives it to charity or whatever, it will be sold for the price that it demands. And that price entirely ignores the specific labor that went into it. It ignores the labor dimension. And so the reason why Marx starts with a commodity here is because he wants to get underneath the price and recognize that prices are incredibly important in and of themselves, but they obscure the labor time that went into the commodity. Now, how does a price get developed? Well, think of barter. Effectively, let's go back to the fisherman and the baker. The fisherman says to the baker, well, I have this fishing rod. It took me a day or 2 days or whatever to produce this fishing rod. And the baker goes, well, I can give you 10 loaves of bread for that. That's an entire day's production of loaves. I will give it to you in exchange for the fishing rod, and you will be able to eat that 10 loaves over the course of the next couple of days, and et cetera, et cetera. Notice here that what has gone on is that the fishing rod has to be compared to the bread. There's a comparison that goes on. This comparison takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of bickering and arguing and back and forth, and it's very mentally taxing comparing one thing versus another. And so for various historical reasons, which I hope are somewhat self-evident, but if you want to get into the details, I can make a video on it. One commodity eventually just becomes the standard by which all other commodities are measured. In Croatia, for instance, they're measured by pelts. In fact, today the name of their money is actually still pelts, the Croatian word for pelts. In the vast majority of the world, it became gold. China, it became silver. Kind of doesn't matter what it is. It sort of does. It shouldn't be something that degrades easily, and it should be something that should be relatively easy to exchange. But overall, what eventually this commodity that becomes the universal equivalent, everything can be exchanged for it, and society eventually creates sort of this unspoken rule or law that says that if you have that commodity, if you have gold, you can acquire whatever the hell you want. You can acquire food, you can acquire land, you can acquire children, you can acquire people, you can acquire all sorts of things. And so this begins to become known as money. And money starts to take the place of exchange value. It becomes the measurement by which exchange value is determined. And it's critical to understand here that this confusion, this obfuscation that money provides over a particular good, that is the thing that makes it hard to measure the amount of labor behind the good. But it also makes it a heck of a lot easier to trade the good. You don't have to sit there and, okay, well, I heard from this person and that person that the average amount of time it takes to grow this much grain is about 6 months, and so that's about approximate. You don't have to do all that math. The value is provided to you almost out of nowhere as money. This is worth £5. This is worth $10. The minimum wage is $15 or $14 or $12. You can basically begin to understand commodities almost exclusively through their prices. And Marx spends a bit of time on this, but we ultimately have to move on, because money is incredibly important because it makes trade easier. And that's really critically important for the creation of the market. Now, the market has always existed. It has existed all throughout history in very interesting sort of forms. Very often, if you read David Graeber or Karl Polanyi, it's very clear that the market was actually quite subservient to religious or sort of social forms of control. In ancient China, for instance, the market, merchants were actually considered to be a lower kind of person than even peasants. And so it was actually quite common in ancient China for merchants to build up enough money to buy land so that they could become peasants, because that was an improvement for their social standing. There are many stories of merchants sort of existing on the margin of society. But ultimately, we have to reckon with its existence. And so, for most of history, the market serves as a way to sort of trade to satisfy wants. I have loaves, you have a fishing rod, I want to fish, you want loaves of bread, It's not super complicated there. Now, if we're in a society that has money, which is any society that has existed for the past 2,000 years, or even further back, it's a matter of argument. But anyway, assuming that we do exist in a world with money, I can literally say to this person, okay, well, that fishing rod is worth about £1, and a pound buys a dozen loaves of bread. Well, there you go. So, we don't even have to physically exchange gold or money, or paper money, or any kind of money. We can just discover what the equivalent, what the price of each good is, and figure out how much of each good we need to give to our friend. But you see, this is incredibly inconvenient. That's why markets started springing up, where you have these physical locations where a baker could walk in with his or her bread, and she could basically sit there and be like, okay, well, one loaf of bread is worth a shilling, or 10 cents, or whatever. And people would walk by, and hopefully she'd be able to sell enough of this bread to make enough money to purchase whatever else she was hoping to buy. Whatever she's doing, she's starting off with a commodity, normally a commodity that you yourself or someone else close to you made. You change it into money, which is very difficult, but once you have the money, then the rest of it's pretty simple. You have the money, so you just waltz over to someone who's selling, or happens to be selling, fishing rods, and you say, here you go, here's the money, there's the fishing rod, Bob's your uncle. So money makes things super, super easy, but money serves this very interesting purpose, because what happens if, for some reason, whatever, I happen to be a tribal leader, or I'm a warlord, or I'm a local mayor, or whatever. I happen to have a ton of money. I have a lot of it for various reasons. I'm taxing people. For whatever reason, legitimate or not legitimate, I just happen to end up with a lot of money. Well, I could, if I have, let's say I have hundreds of pounds. I have hundreds of pounds, and I walk into this market, and I decide to buy the bread that's presented to me, and I happen to take it several towns away, and they happen to have lots of money for some reason, but they happen to have no bread. And so I'm able to sell it to them for more money than the amount of money I bought. I make profit. Hey, what do you know? That doesn't tend to happen very often back then, simply because if people don't have any food, they normally don't have any money. But anyway, if I have lots of money, how do I make more money? Well, I could try buying low and selling high, buying cheap, selling dear, and I might make lots of money doing that. And people still to this day make tons of money doing that. That's a thing that has not stopped. But Marx says that having control over one specific kind of commodity gives you this magical ability to just constantly make profit. So what is Marx talking about? Well, he says there's one commodity that you can that actually will physically cost less on the market than the amount of value it gives you. Well, what is that? Well, it's labor. And so as capitalism begins to develop in various places where it developed, all across the world, rich people began to find various people which, for various historical reasons, needed money and couldn't survive on their own, and they used their wealth to purchase raw materials, so wood, for instance, a factory, or some, more often than not, just like the saws and axes and whatever that's required to make the actual object. And then you hire someone to actually go make the object. You say, I'm going to pay you this much to go and make me chairs out of that wood. Okay? And this is where Marx sort of reaches an epiphany. So what is going on here? So when you're taking your money and you purchase a bunch of commodities which are used to create another commodity like a chair, so you're taking wood and turning it into a chair, you're increasing the value of that wood, right? That wood suddenly has a lot more value because it's now a chair. Like, if I'm purchasing the chair, I don't have to spend all that time turning the wood, which if the chair was not made, turning that wood into a chair. I don't have to waste that much time. I could just buy the chair. Well, that's wonderful. But there's a small problem here. What inherent in the chair gives it more value than that wood? Well, it's the labor that went into the chair. And it's this investment in creating more and more chairs, and eventually you centralize, you hire more people, and all that good stuff. And the thing is, what tends to happen is, as capitalism sort of develops and grows, it tends to make it does not tend to, it always, according to Marx, makes workers produce more than the amount needed to keep those workers alive or to maintain those workers' living standards. This is an interesting claim, but it makes a lot of sense. Why would you hire someone and then pay them the same amount, like an amount that's high enough so that when you end up selling the chair, you don't make any money? Why are you doing that? You're not doing it out of your own charity. You're not doing it out of your own kindness. You're doing it to make money. So the wood is going to cost whatever it's going to cost. The tools also, you're buying them. They're going to cost whatever they're going to cost. But the worker, you can negotiate with. And in this situation, the worker needs your money to live. So you, as the people with money, can say to those without money, well, it's going to be like this, workers. You're going to make $50,000 a year approximately. You get to buy a house, you get maybe a car, you get to live in debt, and you get to die with almost no assets. Maybe you take a vacation once. Maybe, if you're lucky. The worker says, well, considering that my options are destitution and poverty, I will take this offer, and I will work for you. And so, going back to Marx's math here, Marx says that the amount of value created in the chair, there is a sort of this political power that the capitalist, the rich person, uses by virtue of the fact that they own the wood, they own the tools, they more or less own the worker. They can make the worker work for less money than the amount of value they put into that chair. And then they sell that chair and they gain a profit. And so Marx calls this excess value surplus value, because it's excess. It's over the amount of value that is necessary for that worker. And this, again, forms the fundamental crux of how capital works. Capital is money that is invested into production. And production is whenever you take a raw material, you imbue it with labor power, and you then sell that commodity for some kind of price. To put this into a realistic and very tangible way, if you work 8 hours, it only takes 2 hours or so before you've made enough money for your boss for them to pay your wage. Okay, well, what am I doing for the next 5 hours? Well, for the next 5 hours, you're going to be making money for your boss and for all the shareholders and for all of them, so they can live in yachts and fly around the world in private jets and do all that amazing stuff. And you might think to yourself, well, hold on. Whoa. Like, hasn't the wages sort of risen and fallen? Like, isn't this all very contingent? Well, yes. The ratio, the amount that your boss gets relative to the amount that you get paid, that depends honestly on the state of class struggle in your particular country. In Europe, in some areas of Europe, people are paid more because those workers are less willing to work for lower wages, and they're less willing to put up with a lower living standard. And so producing in those countries is a lot more expensive, and you have this this tension, this struggle that occurs there. And so capital, in the act of seeking profit, to sort of put a bow on this, capital always has to employ labor. It has to get that labor to do something productive, which is make something. And it has to pay those laborers less than the amount of value that they produce. And that's how capital works. And plus or minus some conversations about the working day and some historical analysis and a very great chapter on money, that's the bulk of Das Kapital. It's this understanding that capitalism and capital is the structure upon which you and other people like you are employed to make things for society that makes more money for your bosses than it makes for you. And that secret is what Marx was trying to get at when he started writing this very long piece of work. I hope you enjoyed this. If you liked it, please give me a subscription, and please maybe share it with a friend and tell them about it. If you have any comments or criticism, please do not hesitate to let me know in the comment section below. And I hope you have a good day, and I hope you take away from this that you are worth more than the amount you're paid. You're always worth more than the amount you're paid. Have a good day.